The hijab. It's one of the most visible, most recognized symbols of Islam today. But what if I told you the Quran never actually mandates it? Well, today we're unpacking the ideas from the book The Quran and the Myth of Mandated Veiling, which makes the pretty bold claim that the practice is really a myth, something rooted in human tradition, not scripture.
And really, the entire analysis in this book boils down to this one single question. Is this a divine command, or is it a human one? The author argues that to get to the truth, you have to peel back centuries of culture and interpretation and go right to the source itself, the Quran.
Now, before we jump into the text, we have to acknowledge what the hijab really represents. I mean, for millions of women, it is a deeply personal and powerful symbol of their faith and their identity. But as we all know, it's also at the center of some really intense debates, both inside and outside the Muslim world.
So how does the author even begin to build this case? Well, the whole approach is to set aside all the later commentaries, all the traditions, and go straight back to the original Arabic text. The idea here is that the uninterpreted scripture is where you'll find the answer. Okay, so this brings us to the absolute core of the book's argument. And believe it or not, it all starts with just one word, hijab. What does that word actually mean in the Quran? Because the answer, well, it might surprise you. According to the author, the main meaning of hijab as it's used in the Quran isn't a headscarf at all. Nope. Instead, it consistently refers to some kind of barrier, a screen, or a curtain, something that physically separates one space from another. And the author backs this up by pointing to every single time the word hijab appears in the scripture. And in every case, it's used to describe a partition. It's a veil between paradise and hell, an invisible screen, a curtain for the prophet's wives, even a metaphorical barrier between hearts. And this right here is the author's main linguistic point, summed up perfectly. Based on how the Quran uses its own language, they argue hijab is just a general word for a barrier, and it's never, not once, used to mean a woman's head covering specifically. All right, so if the word hijab doesn't mean headscarf in the Quran, then what does the scripture actually say about modesty? This leads us to what is probably the single most important verse in this whole debate, the one that's so often pointed to as the divine command for veiling. And this is where the author says you find a critical difference in translation. On the left, you've got a common version where you can see words like faces and next have been added in parentheses. The author argues those words just aren't there in the original Arabic. The translation on the right sticks only to the original words. So what do those words actually mean? Okay, the first key word is khimar. The author explains that this is a really general term for any kind of covering. It could mean a dress, a shawl, a blanket, anything. The argument is that it absolutely does not specifically mean a headscarf. And the second key word here is juyub. The author says this word translates directly and simply to chests or bosoms. So when you put it together, the instruction is to take a khimar, a covering, and draw it over the juyub, the chest. So, putting it all together, the author's conclusion on this verse is pretty clear. The instruction from God was about covering the chest. And they make a huge point of this. The specific Arabic words for head or hair are completely, totally absent from this passage. Okay, so if the command to veil isn't in the Quran, according to this argument, then where on earth did it come from? Well, the author argues that it wasn't a divine command at all, but a cultural one, something that was absorbed from the powerful empires and other faiths that surrounded early Muslim societies. The author's view is that veiling was basically absorbed into early Muslim culture from all over the place. They point to the oral traditions that came later, the hadith, but also to customs that were already there. I mean, head covering was already practiced in some Christian, Jewish, Persian, and Byzantine circles, particularly for upper-class women. And to show why they're so skeptical of these later traditions, the author brings up this pretty wild example. They point out that even within one of the most respected collections of hadith, you find multiple, totally conflicting stories about when and why this so-called hijab verse was even revealed. This, they say, really casts doubt on its authority. So, we've looked at the linguistic argument, we've looked at the historical argument. What's the big takeaway here? After all that, what does the author believe the Quran's ultimate message on how to dress really is? The author points to this verse as the true foundation, the real principle of modesty in the Quran. It says, yeah, physical garments are for covering and for looking nice, but the best garment, the one that matters most, is good conduct, righteousness.
And that, right there, is the central thesis of the entire book. The argument concludes that the Quran cares way more about inner piety and modest behavior, for both men and women, by the way, than it does about any specific mandated piece of clothing like a headscarf.
So, in the end, this whole analysis leaves us with a much bigger question, one that really applies to any faith, doesn't it? Where exactly do we draw the line between divine scripture and human tradition? Because how we answer that, well, it shapes the beliefs and the daily lives of millions of people all over the world.